Ken Shamrock's name once headlined the biggest events in MMA history. They called him the world's most dangerous man. He fought in the first UFC. He headlined in Japan. He battled in WWE. He was everywhere. But now, no one talks about him. Forgotten, ignored, left behind by the very world he helped create. This is the story of how a true pioneer of MMA went from legend to living in the shadows. And it all started with one fight that changed everything. Before the belts, before the lights, before the world ever heard the term mixed martial arts, Ken Shamrock was already fighting for survival. His story didn't start in an octagon. It started in a group home. Born Kenneth Kilpatrick in Macon, Georgia, Ken bounced between abusive households and the streets as a young boy. He was stabbed, beaten, and abandoned before he turned 13. But instead of being broken, he became harder, tougher. The world pushed him into the dirt, and he crawled out swinging. His salvation came in the form of Bob Shamrock, a man who ran a home for troubled boys and later adopted Ken as his own son. Under Bob's guidance, Ken found structure, wrestling, discipline, and most importantly, belief. What followed was a journey few could survive, let alone master. Ken transitioned into professional wrestling in the late 1980s, but made his true mark in Japan's Pancrase organization. There, fighters combined elements of catch wrestling and striking in a brutal hybrid style that was a direct ancestor of modern MMA. Ken didn't just participate, he dominated. His fights were raw, unscripted, and dangerous. He quickly became a fan favorite for his intensity and refusal to tap. They called him the King of Pancrase, and Japan embraced him as a true warrior. Then came the Ultimate Fighting Championship. In 1993, Ken entered the inaugural UFC 1 tournament. He wasn't just a participant, he was the face of violence incarnate, a muscle-bound grappler with piercing eyes and a stone jaw. He submitted Patrick Smith with ease before running into a storm named Royce Gracie. That loss didn't define him, it fueled him. He returned to UFC 3, then UFC 5, where he fought Gracie to a 36-minute draw, a fight that helped define the raw unpredictability of early MMA. He became the first superfight champion, a precursor to the modern UFC title. His fights weren't about points, they were about survival. He wasn't trying to outscore his opponents, he was trying to dominate them, to finish them. And in those early days, no one embodied the UFC's chaotic spirit more than Ken Shamrock. Every headline screamed his name, the world's most dangerous man. Not a nickname, an identity. One earned in rings, in cages, and on streets most wouldn't dare walk down. But the fame wasn't enough. Ken had bigger ambitions, and soon, the sport that he helped legitimize would be left behind for a bigger paycheck and brighter lights. By the mid to late 1990s, Ken Shamrock was one of the most recognizable faces in combat sports. But MMA, still young and misunderstood, wasn't paying what it should have. Pay-per-views were niche, sponsorships were rare. Fighters like Ken bled for pennies, while promoters raked in controversy-fueled headlines. So when the WWF, now known as WWE, came calling, Ken said yes. It was a transition that baffled some fans. From blood sport to scripted entertainment, from real fights to rehearsed promos. But to Ken, it wasn't about authenticity. It was about opportunity. WWE offered money, reach, and longevity. In 1997, he made his debut, instantly branded as a legitimate tough guy in a world of larger-than-life characters. And it worked. The fans loved him. His real fighting credentials made him stand out in a sea of gimmicks. He wasn't wearing a cape or swinging chairs for fun. He looked like he'd kill you if you blinked the wrong way. He feuded with stars like The Rock, Triple H, and Undertaker, earning himself a loyal following and a solid mid-card push. He won the Intercontinental Championship and the King of the Ring in 1998. But behind the theatrics, Ken was living two lives. He still trained like a fighter, still viewed himself as one, but WWE was a machine that cared more about merchandise than martial arts. And as the years went on, it took its toll, physically and mentally. The grueling travel schedule, the constant wear and tear, the mental tug-of-war between kayfabe and real-life combat, all of it began to chip away at him. There were whispers that he wanted to return to real fighting, that the hunger never left. And despite his success in WWE, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd left something unfinished in MMA. UFC had continued without him. Fighters like Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell were rising, and the sport was changing rapidly. Ken saw his opportunity, not just to return, but to reclaim his throne. But when he did return, he didn't find glory. He found a sport that had evolved without him, and a fan base that had started to forget. In 2002, Ken Shamrock stepped back into the UFC octagon, but it wasn't the same arena he had helped build. The sport had grown. Fighters were faster, younger, and more well-rounded. The UFC had been purchased by Zuffa. Rules were in place. Athletic commissions now regulated fights. The raw brawling of the 90s had been replaced with structured, strategic combat. Still, Ken walked in with his head high. His return fight against Tito Ortiz wasn't just a bout, it was a grudge match. A clash between the old guard and the new. Ortiz had mocked him, called him washed up, dismissed his legacy. For Ken, it wasn't just about winning, it was about proving that he still belonged. He didn't. The fight ended with Ken on his back, brutalized. Ortiz smashed him with elbows and fists until the referee mercifully stepped in. Ken stood up, dazed but proud, giving Tito the middle finger in one last show of defiance. But the damage was already done. He fought Tito 2 more times, lost again, and again. Each loss chipped away at his myth. The world's most dangerous man wasn't dangerous anymore. He was a stepping stone for the next generation. The comeback fights continued. He fought Rich Franklin, lost. Fought Sakuraba in Japan, lost. He was slower, his reactions dulled. His body, once carved from granite, now betrayed him, but the check still cashed. So he kept going. But fans started turning on him, not because they hated him, but because it hurt to watch. They remembered the warrior. Now they saw the wounded veteran chasing something that was no longer there. To make things worse, Dana White, the face of the modern UFC, publicly clashed with Ken, called him irrelevant, mocked him in press conferences, refused to acknowledge his place in UFC history. The same organization Ken helped launch was now actively working to erase his role. And while he took those hits in silence, the financial problems were just beginning. By the late 2000s, Ken Shamrock's name no longer carried the power it once did in the fight world. But his financial obligations never faded. The same man who once headlined the biggest events in UFC and WWF history now found himself surrounded by debts, legal troubles, and unpaid bills. Despite all his years in the cage and the ring, Ken wasn't a millionaire. The early UFC paydays were notoriously low. Even when he joined WWE, salaries back then weren't the massive guaranteed contracts wrestlers see today. What he made was good for the time, but the years of injury, therapy, and travel quickly chipped away at his earnings. And with no pension, no health care benefits, and no support structure from any promotion, Shamrock was left to figure it out alone. In 2008, things worsened. Ken tested positive for steroids just before a fight with Robert Barry in the UK. He was suspended and fined, denying intentional use, but acknowledging his body needed help to keep up. The scandal crushed his already fading marketability. Promoters pulled back. Sponsors disappeared. Fans mocked instead of praised. It was another black mark on a legacy that was already in decline. But it didn't end there. In the years that followed, Ken found himself in legal disputes, most notably a public lawsuit against the UFC and Zuffa over unpaid licensing fees and image rights. He claimed that the organization was using his likeness in video games and promotional material without compensation. The UFC pushed back hard. Dana White dismissed the claims, stating Shamrock owed them more money than they owed him. The legal battle turned ugly, and by the end of it, Ken had lost the case, and even more of his standing in the sport. He later filed for bankruptcy. Reports showed assets that were dwarfed by liabilities, legal fees, and personal debt. It was a heartbreaking reality. The man who helped create the UFC was now scraping together seminars, small wrestling appearances, and autograph signings to survive. Meanwhile, newer Mature UFC stars were signing million-dollar deals, being promoted globally, being inducted into the Hall of Fame. Ken Shamrock, the original icon, was left in the shadows, buried beneath lawsuits, medical bills, and the sound of a sport that had long since stopped calling his name. What made it worse? Even his role in shaping the sport was now being questioned, or completely forgotten. At one point, Ken Shamrock was synonymous with the UFC. He was the face of early MMA, the guy who wore his heart on his sleeve, who went to war with Gracie, Ortiz, and Fry. His name was always in the conversation. But over time, that conversation changed, and Ken's name began to vanish. The UFC began celebrating its pioneers with highlight reels and documentaries, yet Shamrock was often left out. While Royce Gracie was praised as the father of MMA, Ken, who went toe-to-toe with him more than once, was barely acknowledged. Chuck Liddell, Randy Couture, and even Tank Abbott were given more spotlight when discussing UFC's early days. Ken became an afterthought in the very story he helped write. The UFC Hall of Fame inducted Gracie, then Liddell, then Couture, but year after year, Ken's name was missing. Dana White made it clear Ken's public criticisms, lawsuits, and declining relevance had cost him. When asked about Shamrock, White didn't mince words. He called him a has-been and accused him of being ungrateful. Whether fair or not, the message was loud. Ken wasn't welcome anymore. Worse still, MMA fans, especially younger ones, began to view him not as a pioneer, but as a cautionary tale. His final fights were often used in meme compilations, showing an aging man being knocked out or submitted. The early Pancrase wars, the original UFC battles, the rivalry with Tito, those were fading in public memory. In their place, ridicule, misunderstanding, silence. In interviews, Ken would often bite his tongue when asked about his legacy. He'd smile, nod, and try to focus on the positives, but sometimes he'd break. He admitted the UFC's erasure hurt him. "They act like I was never there," he once said. "But I remember when there were just 8 of us in a tournament, fighting for respect, fighting to make this thing real." He wasn't bitter for recognition. He was bitter for being forgotten. And that feeling, that emptiness, was compounded by something even worse. The realization that even if he wanted to rebuild, his body and the world weren't ready to let him. Even after the losses, the lawsuits, and the legacy distortion, Ken Shamrock refused to stop fighting. Literally and figuratively. He had nothing left to prove, but everything to reclaim. And so, in his 50s, Ken looked for new arenas to compete in, and new ways to tell his story. In 2019, he announced the launch of Valor Bare Knuckle, his own bare-knuckle fighting promotion. It was his attempt to return to the roots of combat. No gloves, no gimmicks, just raw, stripped-down violence. He promised fighter-first contracts, safety protocols, and integrity. He believed Valor BK could be his second legacy, a spiritual extension of what the UFC used to be before the corporations took over. But the world had moved on. The events were poorly attended, sponsorship was limited, press coverage was minimal, viewership numbers were disappointing. Ken tried to push through, gave speeches, promoted the events himself, even stepped back into the ring at age 55 for Impact Wrestling just to build attention for the brand. But it didn't catch fire. There were too many other promotions, too many distractions, and too little interest in Ken's new venture. He eventually faded from Valor's spotlight, and the promotion quietly went dark. Still, the hunger didn't die. In 2015, long before Valor, Ken had even returned to the cage against Kimbo Slice in Bellator, a bizarre, tragic bout between two men whose prime had long passed. The fight ended in another KO loss. Critics called it a circus. Fans winced at the sight of Shamrock being dropped again. But to Ken, it was a chance to rewrite the ending, even if just a little. Later, in 2016, he faced Royce Gracie one final time, but it was a shell of their former rivalry. The fight ended quickly, anticlimactically. The crowd was silent. The legend had faded. In his heart, Ken believed that if he could just find the right moment, the right platform, he could remind the world of who he was, of what he did. But every attempt felt like shouting into a void. The crowds were smaller, the applause quieter, the memories distant. And Ken Shamrock, once a titan in two worlds, found himself doing what no warrior ever wants to do, trying to prove he still mattered. Beneath the bravado, beneath the legend, beneath the persona of the world's most dangerous man, Ken Shamrock is, at his core, a man who's suffered, physically, emotionally, privately. The kind of suffering that doesn't go viral, the kind that lingers long after the fight is over. Ken has often spoken about his past, his broken childhood, and how that rage fueled his fighting style. But what happens when the fight ends? When the adrenaline stops? When the pain doesn't? Years of punishment left Ken's body in ruins, neck injuries, knee surgeries, chronic pain. His face, once a chiseled symbol of toughness, now bears the wear of countless wars. He's opened up about the toll it's taken, not just physically, but mentally. In podcast appearances, his voice shakes when he talks about memory lapses, anxiety, and isolation. He's admitted that there were nights when the pain became unbearable, when he questioned his worth, when he wondered if anyone still cared. But even more difficult than the physical suffering was the silence from those closest to him. Ken has struggled with estrangement in his personal life. His relationship with his adopted brother Frank Shamrock, another MMA legend, has been icy at best. Despite sharing a surname and a sport, their feud has lasted decades. They rarely speak, and when they do, it's in sound bites filled with resentment and unresolved tension. Ken has said, "Frank betrayed me. He took my name and made it something else. Something I didn't recognize." Family fractures extended further. Ken's marriages struggled under the weight of his lifestyle. He admitted that during the height of his fame, he was absent, angry, and consumed by competition. Reconnecting with his children has been a long, painful process, one filled with apology and humility. In recent years, Ken has turned more to faith. He speaks openly about his Christianity and how it's helped him find peace in a life that has so often been defined by chaos. He's spoken at churches and Christian conferences, telling stories not of domination, but of defeat, and how he's still learning to live with both. But even in that faith, there's still pain. Because redemption doesn't always come with a reunion, and forgiveness doesn't always lead to recognition. Ken has healed some wounds, but the scars, both on his body and his soul, remain. And while the fans once chanted his name in stadiums, now most don't know what became of him at all. Today, Ken Shamrock is still alive, still training, still trying, but to many, he's already gone. He lives quietly, appears at fan expos, signs autographs, does interviews with niche MMA podcasts. He posts on social media from time to time, motivational quotes, clips from his fights, reflections on his journey. But the engagement is low, the comments are sparse, the MMA world has moved on, the UFC has moved on, and Ken, whether he admits it or not, is no longer part of the conversation. He isn't honored during UFC broadcasts. His fights rarely make the highlight reels. He hasn't been asked to induct anyone into the Hall of Fame. New fans know the name, but not the impact. They see memes, not milestones. Every now and then, a fan recognizes him at the airport, in a gym, a polite nod, a photo, a thank you. But it's different now. It's no longer awe. It's nostalgia, like seeing a retired superhero in civilian clothes decades after his last great battle. Ken still tries to contribute. He's offered mentorship to young fighters. He's pitched ideas to promotions. He's proposed tributes, documentaries, legacy projects. But most fall on deaf ears, or worse, are dismissed with a smile and a polite no. He is still strong, still capable, but in the eyes of the MMA machine, he is part of the past. And in a sport obsessed with the next knockout, the next viral clip, the next superstar, the past is disposable. The same industry he helped build, brick by bloody brick, has left him in the cold. There are moments of recognition. A podcast might mention his name in passing, a fighter might list him as an early inspiration, but these moments are fleeting, like sparks in the dark. They light up briefly, then vanish. Ken Shamrock doesn't complain. He doesn't beg for respect, but you can hear it in his voice when he talks about his legacy, the weight of being forgotten, of knowing he was a pioneer, and still waking up every day wondering if anyone remembers. And that's the tragedy. Not the injuries, not the losses, but the silence. Because sometimes the worst thing you can do to a warrior is stop saying his name. Redemption is a tricky thing. It doesn't always come with a championship belt or a standing ovation. Sometimes it's just being seen, being remembered, having your name spoken with the respect it earned. And that's all Ken Shamrock wants. regrets. He doesn't need to fight again. He's not chasing one more win. He's not asking for millions. What he wants is to know that everything he gave, his blood, his body, his legacy, wasn't for nothing. He wants people to remember that when the UFC had no rules, no gloves, no weight classes, he was there. When MMA was banned in half the country, he stood proud. When fighters trained in garages and fought in cages that wobbled, he was building the sport into what it is today. And yes, he made mistakes. He stayed too long. He fought too many times. He let pride drive decisions that cost him. But if we judge legends only by how they finish, we miss the entire point of who they were when it mattered. Ken Shamrock deserves to be remembered as more than a name on a bracket, more than a meme, more than a footnote in a sport that wouldn't exist without him. Because beneath the bruises, beneath the controversy, beneath the aging face and quiet life, there's still a warrior, still a pioneer, still the world's most dangerous man. And maybe, just maybe, it's time for the sport to look back and say, thank you, before it's too late.